We've got diplomatic goals, we've developmental goals, humanitarian, commercial, cultural. All of these factors tend to motivate aid programs. Now, your bilaterals, some bilateral donors are a little bit better than others in terms of they wouldn't have kind of major political goals or major kind of cultural programs that they want to promote. But some of the more established ones, the larger players, the GTZs and the USAIDs, absolutely, self-interest, economic and political, is fundamental to driving their aid programs. This aspect of post 9/11 that is quite worrying is this blending of defence, diplomacy, and development. Because now it's really muddying the waters, for instance, in Afghanistan and Iraq, where you have, for instance, the US or the British Army actually doing development. And for locals, then there's this confusion around, so what are they? What are they doing? Are they providing peacekeeping roles? Are they providing water and sanitation? And some people say, well, surely that's a good thing, because what you're doing there is you're showing kind of the human side. But at the same time, often a lot of the programs that are being implemented very, very poorly. They don't actually have the expertise to implement participatory boreholes, creating committees for people to look after them after they've actually been established, or they haven't the committees, the expertise in terms of promoting kind of agricultural sustainable livelihoods programs. So you tend to get this blurring, and you're getting really bad development coming out of it, where they've kind of circumvented the traditional aid mechanisms to some extent, and you get bad development and a kind of a mix of bad defence as well. And with it, as I said, this push to kind of widen up the kind of the definitions around what exactly constitutes is meant by aid. So I think it's one for civil society to keep an eye on. So what are the common criticisms? And I really like that quote from Lancaster. We asked the questions and gave the answers. Yeah? Top down. I fly into Nigeria. Yeah? I go to Makurdi. I look at their education system and I say, well, I know what's wrong with it. You do this to fix it. Yeah? Then I leave. And throughout the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s and the 90s, you have these terrible top-down programs where the donors decide the agenda. It's the donors that decide what sort of investment takes place in education, what sort of investment takes place in healthcare. Often major infrastructural projects are donor-driven because of this dependence. Could you imagine if the UK government had to sit down with donors, and it was the donors that decided how they would spend their money in terms of health and education? The Irish had to listen to the Chinese and the Brazilians and the Russians saying how they should spend their money in terms of healthcare. The power dynamic there and the shaping of an agenda that, you don't have the answers, but you don't have any sort of real buy-in. This proliferation of agencies and reporting requirements. For every agency, every program, there's a report. Quarterly reports, half-yearly reports, annual reports. Then you have a team that come with the reports that you've sent them because they want to talk to you about the reports and they want to see the projects. Okay. Grand if you're dealing with one donor, it's a headache. What happens though if you're dealing with 30 donors with 2,000 projects? Just doesn't take an awful lot to do the math on that. Each project, quarterly report, 8,000 quarterly reports. Yeah? Then we get a team coming to visit. An awful lot of time is actually taken in just servicing the aid industry. And these agencies are often fighting amongst each other for the right to decide or take the lead in a particular sector. And kind of naked competition, but not in the best interests of the countries receiving it. And I think we've moved on significantly. These sort of criticisms held really up until about the 1990s, and I suppose they still hold today. But there have been moves, as we'll see, to address some of these issues. You know, these terrible standalone projects that were just put into countries with no support, no thinking around the sustainability of it, no thinking around the financial ability, the ability of the country to actually keep it going, no thinking around the technical assistance that was actually required. The lack of selectivity in terms of the countries that were working. Often aid was going into countries and it was being badly used, and yet they continued to receive more aid. Like we take Mobutu, Duvalier, Haiti and Duvalier. You know, these were countries where you were literally you were pouring in millions, hundreds of millions, and it was just disappearing. It was being siphoned off up north. Yeah? And what were people getting out of that? Like, what benefit were you actually leaving? What legacy were you leaving? And this would be kind of a basis for the criticisms that Moyo has about aid. In fact, not only was it a waste of aid, you were actually undermining potential democratic forces there. Because you were keeping regimes in power that wouldn't have been able to stay in power. You kept them, you funded them, and the abuses that went with it through your aid program. You create, by providing aid, an automatic democratic deficit. Because governments don't have to tax their people because they can get the tab picked up through aid flows. If they don't tax, then they have no interest in listening to what people have to say. And she would see these as kind of major issues, major kind of counter arguments to aid and the benefits coming from it. In terms of the size and the irregularity of funds, like Irish Aid is a classic example of that. As soon as our budget got hit, we cut 250 million off the aid budget. And you think, that's terrible. What about all the countries that were relying on Irish aid funding to fund schools, to fund healthcare, to fund power, to fund solar? All of a sudden, that's gone. How can you plan on that sort of basis? And aid tends to be one of the budget lines that you cut, because the constituency is not here, the constituency is out there. Yeah? So it's much easier to cut their funding rather than cut the funding within the country itself. And then this, I've kind of mentioned that, this creation of parallel structures. Often you had these bizarre situations where the government was sidelined. The district office had no real role in development planning at district level. That was done through cluster meetings of donors. They would invite the district commissioner along to have a look at the agenda and contribute to a certain extent, but often you could have the agenda actually driven by the multinationals, the bilaterals, and the big NGOs that were there. Absolutely bizarre situation. So all of these are kind of grounds for criticism. Now, that said, I've got to say now, I'm actually a supporter of aid. I think aid brings a lot of benefits, but I do think we need to improve the system. I've personally seen wonderful examples of how aid can help governments address issues around healthcare, around infrastructure, around education, from both kind of a small scale and a large scale. But that's not to say I don't see elements of the aid system which I think should be criticised. I robbed this from Olive Towie from Concern. I hope she won't mind. Yeah, and she gives that wonderful example there. Like Ghana, for instance, the health ministry was reporting to donors in 17 different ways. Each donor had a different set of reporting requirements. And in Mozambique, they had over 1,000 bank accounts, which the government was looking after to meet the donors' admin requirements. And that's Moyo's book. Key issues of fuels corruption, undermines democracy, creates dependency. And she has very, very radical proposals around how you get around that. She basically says cut off all the aid in 5 years.
And replace it with what?
capital markets. She believes governments can turn to the capital markets. We've all had a fairly bitter experience of capital markets. But that would be her solution. Now, Moyo comes from a very particular perspective. She works for Goldman Sachs. Yeah? So she's very much part of the whole kind of the neoliberal, the free market type system. And that's what she would say. She says, cut off all aid. Tell government you're going to cut it off. Taps, turn it off in 5 years' time. And she said, with that, you'll have a major change in the way governments actually deal with their people in terms of the sort, how they look for funding and how they actually spend money. What do you think? Any comments? It's a fairly radical agenda. Any?
Well, the market isn't self-correcting. I mean, it's been proven to be that over the years. So you can't depend on the market getting you out of difficulties if you get into an economic black hole. So you need some sort of government intervention there when things go completely astray.
Absolutely. Like, it's incredibly selective, the market, in terms of who it'll give money to.
Yeah.
The Republic of Ireland and Greece had trouble getting money from the market. Yeah.
Who are we talking about when we say the market?
The market is where the government actually borrows itself off its own account. Global investors. So it says basically, okay, I'm going to launch a bond. Yeah. I want to sell 100 million of these. 200 million. I will want the money for 5 years, so I'll repay it in 5 years' time, and I'll pay an interest rate, what they call a coupon. The interest rate will be 6%, and it literally goes to the market, to investors, and it says, that's your bond, 100 million, it's going to pay 6% for 5 years. Who wants it? Who wants to buy it? And then you see these, whether it's oversubscribed or undersubscribed. Now, for Greece, for instance, Republic of Ireland, they went to the markets and they said, we've got 6% and nobody was interested. And they said 7%, nobody was interested. 8%, maybe 9%, okay, we'll buy in at 9%. Penal interest rate. Yeah? So the markets are going to penalise you if they think there's any sort of chance of you not being able to repay it. And I think
surely that's going to be like a double whammy, just as the whole economic crisis happened in the first place, if you're asking somebody who has no money to pay an even higher interest rate.
Sadly, that is true. But that is the way it works. Countries that don't need money can borrow at a very cheap interest rate. Countries that need money have to borrow at a very high interest rate. Because those who are giving the money are factoring into account that they may not get that money back. And that's why they charge the really high interest rate, which may actually push countries over the edge and they won't get the money back. It'll be self-fulfilling. But that's another issue. But from the context, when looking at as a proposal for Dambisa Moyo to replace all aid flows through raising money on capital markets, I think is a big, big ask. And it's just, I don't think
Does
it's
she have much support then?
She got a lot of support,
I mean, I agree with her
the
on
money
the
market.
issues. I mean, the first 3 points, I 100% agree. The solution is the one that
You would disagree.
I would disagree in the sense, especially on the second point. But I think that there's two things. I personally agree with the first 3 points. I think they are very clearly defined, and we can actually look for many examples. The solution is the one that I think it's not practical. I mean, I don't think that happens, but I mean, we can also look at the other elements. Whenever we look at the 550, 500, I mean, in the sense of saying like, okay, yeah, if we cut aid in 5 years, then let's cut international the debt. I mean, of the country, which is very radical, but will have huge transformation. Which the thing is that for me, whenever we look at aid, it's like a leak, rather than, okay, we need something drastic. Do you know, so...
It's kind of, incremental change rather than major change.
Yeah.
I think it's, like I said, it definitely she featured, I think, in Time magazine.